Welcome to Land Eco Lightning Talks and Thinking Like a Landscape with Dr. Kevin McGarrigle. In this three-part series on the landscape concept, in part one, I briefly introduced the landscape concept, that is, what makes a landscape a landscape. In part two, I briefly discussed the challenges of scale when dealing with landscapes. And in this part three, I will briefly discuss the importance of landscape dynamics, or variability in time and space. Okay, let's get started. The first point I would like to make is to reflect upon a major paradigm shift in ecology that began in the 1980s and really came to fruition in the early to mid 1990s. And this was the shift from the climax to the dynamic view of ecosystems. Under the climax, or the preceding paradigm, ecosystems in both their structure and function were viewed as tending towards a relatively steady, stable, and persistent, quote, climax state. That is, a condition that would be relatively unchanging over time, albeit with periodic disruptions caused by disturbances, but always being driven by this tendency to get back to this climax state or condition. And a corollary of this climax view was that ecosystems were often viewed as relatively distinct and discrete and isolated entities. That is, we could study and understand ecosystem structure and function without looking at the spatial or temporal context of those ecosystems. That is, we could study ecosystems by just looking within the ecosystem itself and ignoring essentially what was around it in both space and time. But beginning in the 80s, and again coming to fruition in the 90s, we increasingly realized that ecosystems are much more realistically thought of as dynamic systems. That is, that systems don't ever get to a stable, persistent, and consistent endpoint, that in fact they're undergoing change all the time. That in fact their dynamism is what actually better describes these ecosystems and distinguishes one from another. So whereas under the climax view, disturbances were sort of secondary to succession and the climax condition, under the dynamic view, disturbances lay at the core of ecosystem dynamics, and that we are better off describing the ecosystems by their disturbance regime rather than some endpoint that actually never gets realized. And the corollary to this dynamic view is that ecosystems are now viewed as part of a larger landscape mosaic, where transboundary processes such as the movement of energy and materials across edges or across ecosystem boundaries are critical for the understanding of ecosystem structure and function. And this dynamic view represented a major paradigm in landscape ecology, major paradigm shift in landscape ecology, and in fact was one of the principal reasons for the emergence of landscape ecology as a discipline in the 1990s. The second point that derives from this dynamic view of ecosystems is that landscape patterns and processes vary over time. And this is regardless of whether the processes that drive landscape change are based on human activities or natural processes. The example shown on the left for landscape in the Oregon Cascades, where logging or timber harvesting activities has steadily caused changes in landscape patterns and the corresponding processes over time, resulting in landscape dynamics. In the right, an example here shown for a portion of the San Juan National Forest in southwest Colorado, where wildfire is driving the changes in the vegetation patterns and processes over time. So regardless of whether it's human activities or natural disturbance processes, the reality is that all landscape patterns and processes vary over time. And recall from the first talk in this series where we defined landscapes as being comprised of both composition and configuration, where the composition of a landscape refers to the number and types of landscape elements that make up the pattern, and the configuration refers to the spatial arrangement of those landscape elements. And it's the combination of the composition and configuration that make up the pattern that drives processes and vice versa. Importantly, both composition and configuration is dynamic over time in landscapes. The example on the left shows compositional dynamics for a landscape in the north central United States, where we're looking at the amount of a particular association of tree species and how it changes over time in its prevalence. And on the right, we're seeing a measure of landscape configuration, defined here by the contagion metric, which is a measure of overall clumpiness in the vegetation and landscape. And we see that it too is varying over time. So in both cases, regardless of whether it's a compositional metric or configurational metric, we see that the landscape patterns are changing over time. Similarly, landscape patterns and processes vary over space as well as time. In this example, we have a landscape in northern Arizona centered around the San Francisco peaks. And we have three landscapes that vary not only in extent, but in their unique spatial context. The smallest landscape, Sunset Crater, is characterized by a rather contiguous forest broken up by some rather dramatic geological features driven by relatively recent volcanic activity. The San Fran landscape in the middle is dominated by the San Francisco Peaks mountain range in the center that creates a very pronounced elevational gradient in both disturbance and vegetation that drives the patterns and processes in that portion of this broader landscape. And the Peaks landscape, which is the largest of the three, not only embeds this kind of geologic landscape and this montane landscape, but also encompasses some very different biophysical environments to the east and the north, depicted here by the red coloration in the map legend. And while the scale differences among these three landscapes is important and gives rise to the different degrees of variability over time, what I really want to point out here is that the absolute ranges of variation in a variety of state metrics, but here showing an example, the aggregation index, the absolute range of variation varies not because of the scale differences, but because of the unique landscape context. So the Peaks landscape, which is the largest landscape and is shown by the dark solid line at the bottom of this figure, depicts variability over time, as you would expect, but exhibits a relatively low range of variation in the aggregation index, around 78 to 79. The San Fran landscape, the one centered on the San Francisco Peaks mountain range in the middle, is depicted by the red line in this figure. And again, not only does it show variation over time, as we would expect, but its absolute range of variation is much higher, much greater than we saw for the Peaks landscape. Its ranges center around 83 to 84. And as we move to the Sunset landscape, the smallest of the landscape, it too, of course, is dynamic over time, but its absolute range of variation in the aggregation index is now much higher. This change in the range of variation in the metric is due to the differences in the geophysical, or more broadly, biophysical context of each of these three landscapes. They are fundamentally different landscapes, even though they're in close proximity, even though they're part of what might be thought of as an ecological region and managed as one ecological region. They are fundamentally different because of the unique geophysical settings of each of these three landscapes. This dynamic view and the variations in both time and space have very important implications. The first is that landscape dynamics are idiosyncratic, both in space and time. In this case, shown here for time, we're depicting the idea that each time period is unique and thus generates unique dynamics in time, or unique temporal dynamics. In this example here, we're looking at temperature anomalies showing or depicting or highlighting two periods in time: the Little Ice Age centered in the 1600s and the medieval warm period centered in the 1100s, where the temperature conditions were very different, and those temperature conditions gave rise to very different disturbance regimes that generated rather unique pattern process dynamics. Similarly, from a spatial perspective, each geographic extent is unique and generates unique dynamics. In the example here, we're looking at two different locations within the same broader landscape within the Northern Sierras. And these figures are depicting the distribution of developmental stages of forest vegetation, from an open condition to a sapling to a pole, short tree, medium tree, and tall tree condition. So as sites establish trees and then develop over time, ultimately into tall trees, what percentage of the site is in each of these stages? And the bars, the vertical bars, depict the variation over time driven by natural disturbance processes and in how much of the site is in each of these developmental stages. And if we look at just one of the stages, the open condition, so the leftmost two bars, the red and blue bars corresponding to the open condition, we see that these two sites have different ranges of variability. Now, it's important to recognize that these are two sites within the same broader landscape. They have the same overarching disturbance regime, and they're part of the same overarching the same overarching landscape in terms of its kind of geophysical setting. But each of these locations is unique in its exact geophysical setting and context, and that gives rise to unique dynamics. Another important point here, or implication, is that there is no single reference or target condition at any scale, but rather a range of realistic conditions. So for any particular scale, if the system is dynamic, as we have shown, there is no one condition that we would expect to see over time, but rather a range of conditions that we would see over time for any given site. And the range of conditions that we would see at any given site would vary across sites. Ignoring this variability and focusing instead on a single reference condition when designing management actions can have very important ecological consequences. And finally, the implication of all of what I've said so far is that variability rather than central tendency is the only meaningful way to characterize ecological systems and landscapes under this dynamic view. So as shown here conceptually, for a state variable, which might describe some aspect of the composition or configuration of vegetation and how it changes over time, the median condition is simply inappropriate and cannot characterize the dynamic behavior of the system in an appropriate and meaningful way. Ignoring this variability and focusing instead on just the central tendency when designing management actions can have very important ecological consequences. And I want to give an example of why this variability is important. This is a rather interesting and unique study by Gordy Reeves and colleagues at Oregon State University, looking at disturbances and their effects, disturbances in landscape dynamics and their effects on salmonid fish productivity in the Oregon Coast Range. And the idea here is that if disturbances are constant in space and time, then every watershed within this broader ecological province would experience the same kind of level of inputs to the stream from coarse woody debris and boulders and sediment, and produce a kind of a constant, moderate level of habitat complexity for salmonid fish populations that gives rise to sort of a moderate level and steady level of fish productivity from the ecological province. But if instead these systems are driven by variability, which they are, what we see instead then is that some watersheds experience catastrophic disturbances while others are in a period of recovery from previous catastrophic disturbances. And following a catastrophic disturbance, there's massive inputs of coarse woody debris and boulders and sediments such that the habitat is destroyed within the stream channels, and salmon productivity declines or is extirpated entirely. But in other watersheds, they're in states of recovery from those catastrophic disturbances. And as the channels reform through these disturbed watersheds, the habitat complexity is actually orders of magnitude greater than under the constant disturbance scenario, such that salmonid productivity in certain watersheds is exceptionally high because they've undergone this dynamic over time whereby catastrophic disturbances led to declines in productivity locally, but in the long term led to excessively high levels of productivity. And it's this variation over space where watersheds are in different states of disturbance and recovery, where some watersheds have exceptionally high productivity of salmonids, and where that salmonid productivity occurs varies over space over time, results in a much greater productivity of salmonids across the province than if we had constant disturbance over space and time. Again, just an example where variability is actually driving the system's productivity, in this case of salmonid populations. Therefore, we cannot extrapolate landscape pattern processes across space and time. Each landscape is unique spatially, it has a unique geophysical context, and each landscape is kind of unique in its position and time. Example shown here for mean fire returnable for two landscapes that are adjacent to each other that are subject to similar disturbance processes, similar geophysical environment, but yet despite those similarities, they each realize a somewhat unique fire return interval regime, and again, owing to the uniqueness of these landscapes. The take-home message for this presentation is that landscape patterns and processes are dynamic in both space and time, and thus variability is always the best descriptor. And this leads to the third axiom of landscape ecology, which is that ecological systems and landscapes are spatially and temporally dynamic. This is Dr. Kevin McGarrigle signing off from this episode of Land Eco Lightning Talks. I hope this talk has been helpful, and I hope you join me for my next lightning talk. In the meantime, keep on thinking like a landscape.